Welcome to our talk about Salem and its surprising manufacturing history. My name is Bob Booth. I've done some work in earlier phases of Salem's history. I wrote a book a few years ago called Death of an Empire, which was about Salem in its role as an international trader, as the place that really opened commerce for America with Asia, and quickly became a fabulously wealthy place, the richest place per capita in the United States for about 30 years. And it was always my interest in what happened to Salem after its commerce died. And this is what we're looking into right now. And so I'm also introducing Amy Kellett. Amy is a graduate of Salem State University in public history and management. We are partners in this research that we're doing, and we intend to stick with it for the next year. This should end up being a book-length project. I think we've uncovered a number of things that are not only unexpected, but that really do shed new light on early manufacturing and the people involved in doing the work for all of New England. So I believe that Amy will be leading us into starting anew.
I will lead the way. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's bellies are full, so you're going to fall asleep during the talk. So if any place is famous for history, it's Salem. Witches, every which way, every day, and all year long. A sea of creepy curiosities in a harbor that once led straight to China. Wiccan psychics, and the ghost of Hawthorne. 24 old house museums, and tours of every variety. Another 1 million magic shops, and all these combined to make Salem a weird favorite on the menu of history-flavored Massachusetts day trips. Today, though, we're not talking about the witches, or misplaced execution sites, or Salem's recent history, or even its known history. Within the city, we've been studying a large district called the Point, and we've recovered a hugely important part of the history of the city's forgotten past. So, what's the point? Like most Massachusetts cities, Salem has lost its once impressive manufacturing base. Well into the 20th century, Salem produced textiles, shoes, leather, light bulbs, electrical parts, and even board games. Today, the largest remnant of Salem's industrial landscape is the Point. It's 20 acres of closely packed multifamily housing, largely occupied by families from Central and South America, plus the former textile factories of the Pequot Mills, now called Shetland Park. As much as Salem knows, a terrible fire in 1914 wiped out 1/3 of the city's buildings, including all of the structures at the Point. Today's tenements were built after the fire to house industrial workers and their families, most of whom were immigrants from Eastern Europe and French-speaking Canada. Mr. Baker, you're late. That's a first for me. He was my professor. I get to call him out for being late. Sorry. It's a dream of mine. Thank you for letting me have that. Where are we? Current popular knowledge is that the Point begins in 1914. The story of the Point begins in 1914. But how else could anybody possibly know that this fire that destroyed more than 250 acres and thousands of homes and businesses, including the entire Point, underneath it, the story begins 70 years earlier, buried beneath the ashes. We have come upon a task that we have found reminiscent of old Pompeii before excavation. What buildings stood here by the sea? on this peninsula? When were they built? For whom? For what purposes? And how were they occupied? And what was the relation of this neighborhood to the rest of the city? And what was its impact on it? What was happening here? What we have found effectively is a lost 19th century world, a major outpost of industrial revolution, so impressive that this large lithograph was made in 1853 to capture its appearance. The full view of streets and new houses is dominated by a large new cathedral-like textile factory. Starting in 1847, just 11 years after Salem achieved city status, the Point became a symbol of Salem's economic revival, its new identity as a city, and a center of manufacturing.
So, after the Revolution, Salem had, as I mentioned, become a very important seaport, arguably the gateway to Asia for Americans, and uniquely a center of overseas commerce. The captains and crews seized a global opportunity that nobody else quite grasped and began trading both with Europe and with many of the markets in Asia. Here we're looking at a view just after the Revolution. On the left, you see some of Salem's commercial shipping. On the right, you see the Point in its earlier guise from the 1780s as a bucolic piece of land where shipbuilding was going on along the coast. And otherwise, there were herds grazing and crops being grown on the Point in those days. So Salem becomes both a financial and cultural center early on. There's an enormous amount of wealth flowing back to this town. It's not a very big place. There are about 10,000 people, but there are more than 200 vessels trading all over the world. And the money that came back built some very impressive streets and very large houses that still stand today and are part of the cultural and maritime traditions of this place. I think we have another slide. Which, as I said, traded with Europe as well. So here we're looking at a weird German print. They did trade up in the North Sea. They traded everywhere where there was money to be made. And then they went whaling. After trade with Asia and the usual markets collapsed for Salem, it engaged in whaling, and the Point became a place where a couple of whale oil refineries that were steam-powered were put up by entrepreneurs, which didn't last very long, but it was important because it created an infrastructure of people who knew how to build steam engines. So we have a couple of little factories. This is not really representative. This is more looking at the other thing that was happening. As Salem did continue its trade at sea, it was trading largely with Africa and with Brazil to get animal hides and to bring them back to have them cured into leather. And Salem became by the 1830s, Salem was more a center of leather production than it was anything else. So we have shoemaking, leather making. Salem had a modest population growth in the 1830s. It had about 14,000 people by the year 1830, and by 1836 it had 15,000 people. That's the year that it officially became a city. However, it stalled out in the late 1830s, and people were looking for something new, something that would employ large numbers of folks who were, frankly, a lot of the mariners were out of work. And as they looked around, the model that they found was Newburyport, a seaport that had died away even earlier than Salem. And in Newburyport, what they noticed was an overwhelming interest in steam-powered production of cotton. So one of the things Salem was able to draw on at that time in the 1830s was a group of highly skilled mechanics, particularly people in the blacksmith line of work, young men who were interested in this new thing called technology and who were moving on from typical blacksmithing jobs to more intricate work, building prototypes of little steam engines and other pieces of more intricate machinery. And they were learning how to do this by attending the lectures at the Salem Mechanics Hall, which you see built here new about 1840. Both the Freemasons and the Mechanics Society provided free lectures to the public in this new steam-based technology. And a lot of the younger men were very excited about the possibilities of what that could mean. So at the point, we have a few things coming together. The extant maritime trade and the ability to build steam engines and a vision of a brand new type of employment that would be profitable to the merchants who were no longer engaging in wide-ranging maritime commerce, had a lot of money, and wanted to find a way to employ it in Salem. And the way they do that is to build, between 1845 and 1847, the largest steam-powered textile plant in the whole world. And you're looking at it. The Naumkeag Steam Cotton Company had been incorporated in 1839. It was a pretty modest idea at the time. People had been thinking about a Newburyport-like project, and here you're looking at Newburyport's largest factory. They didn't feel that they had the money or the mechanical, technological chops, nor did they have a population that had any experience at all in doing industrial work in Salem. So a few people came together, felt that it was a good idea, but it wasn't until the arrival of a man named David Pingree that all of this really came together. David Pingree was the successor in Salem to a man named Stephen White. And you're looking at Stephen White's portrait because David Pingree was a famously bashful man and secretive who never had his portrait painted. But Stephen White had been the man who led Salem forward in the 1820s through the difficulties of its dying commerce. And it was over an unfortunate incident that happened to involve the assassination of his father by family members that led Stephen to leave Salem, move to Boston. He left behind a beautiful house and a wonderful farm, and slowly, David Pingree bought up all of Stephen White's assets and then took over his role in the community. So David Pingree sees what's going on with this rather modest enterprise, the Naumkeag Steam Cotton Company, still just a company that had been formed to subscribe stock. They didn't have any property. Well, Pingree had already bought the site of one of the whale refineries, and Pingree already had a serious trade with both Brazil and Africa. And one of the things that Pingree had noticed is that the cotton cloth that he exported that he would buy up in Lowell and export over to Zanzibar and particularly East Africa seemed to be growing in popularity. And the more cotton cloth that was landed in those places, the more there was a desire for it. The Africans would take this cotton cloth and repurpose it and cut it up and make it clothing. They would re-dye it. They would make it into fringes. They would turn it into their homes, their garb, and it became, this famous thing is African colorful textiles. These exuberant textiles are all actually just repurposed versions of the cloth coming out of Lowell. And as Lowell realizes that David Pingree is buying this stuff up in vast quantities, they raised the prices on him. So he is highly motivated to find a new source of cotton cloth to export to the ravenous appetite of the markets in Africa. So Pingree's all in. He takes over this rather modest enterprise, and he finds a way to raise the subscription stock value. When he entered into the business, it was at about $225,000. And that's 1844 money. By the time he was done, he'd raised $700,000. And he was ready to take no prisoners in building this enormous place. And what he lacked, of course, being a Salem merchant, was somebody who had the experience as an architect, as a designer, as a builder of something as exotic as a steam-powered cotton mill that was larger than anything ever built in the history of the world. But fortunately, money will buy you the services of Charles T. James of Providence, who was a brilliant architect and mechanical designer, and who had been responsible for 4 of the highly successful but much smaller Newburyport factories. So he is brought in by our boy, David Pingree, to take over the project. And so what we have coming together here is not just the money and the ability, but uniquely, David Pingree builds into this whole process the concept of creating his own currency to trade with Africa. Until that moment, he had either had to send gold and silver over to Zanzibar and East Africa, or he had had to buy cotton cloth at the prices of the producers in Lowell. So by building this factory, by persuading his partners to go very big on all of this, essentially what he has done is to create an endless source of his own currency for trade with Africa. So, I should say, it was quite an amazing vision for a place that had no history. You can see that part of it is driven by an existing maritime commerce, but the impact on Salem was of this enormous building going up in a place that otherwise had been empty. And so we see here a fairly early, incredibly ambitious example of steam power being applied in a harbor setting to the production of cotton textiles. And as you will see, this does not happen without a serious price.
Using microhistory as our theoretical approach, we delved to the street level of Salem in the point at the moment in the 1840s and early 1850s. And we were looking at the immigrants and the in-migrants and the natives that really helped to develop an entirely new culture within Salem and really had a huge impact on Salem's community. So we followed 3 main questions to guide our research. Who were the more than 600 people who worked in this new factory? How did Salem suddenly become the place with the largest steam-powered cotton factory in the world? And what was the impact of the mill and the workers on its city and its people? This is one of the earliest images, known images of the Naumkeag Mill, and it would be just as it appeared when it opened in 1847. We see a giant building, it's 400 feet long, twin-towered, and it dwarfs the humans. The tranquil image here belies the flurry of activity that would have been inside. Gears churning, whirring of looms, the shuffling of 600 pairs of feet on the 4 floors of the Naumkeag Mill. It turns out, as we found, that many of those shuffling feet belonged to children. So aside from single young women, the mill's largest employee was under the age of 13, or largest employee base was under the age of 13. Every year for more than 7 decades, from its inception in 1847, the factory would employ hundreds of children as full-time workers. In the beginning, most of these children were Irish. Then, starting in the 1870s, the children would come from families who had immigrated from Quebec and Poland. All of these images, by the way, these are of Salem children, photographs that were taken by Lewis Hine. The new Naumkeag Steam Cotton Mill was a dangerous place. In a 2-week period in August 1847, 2 little Irish boys, James and Thomas, who were both 9 years old, were killed in accidents, and William, who is a 22-year-old Englishman. There is no doubt that there were other deaths and mutilations as a result of working at the factory in the early years, and there would be thereafter. The script here I wanted to talk a little bit about is from an unattributed diary of a contemporary Salemite that noted the deaths of the factory boys when they did happen. And what is astounding to us is that this is just months after it opened, and the way that the diary refers to it is really more matter of fact. Like, this is part of how it goes. So wherever they came from, the faces were the same. Boys and girls who went to work at age 8 or 9, tethered thereafter to their jobs. They were cut off from education, fresh air, and most of the pastimes of childhood. And so it remained well into the 20th century. By 1912, Lewis Hine, who is famous for his photos of New York City's working families and children, was in Salem, photographing the children of the Point and other various factories throughout the city, who had known so little of their childhood. He was sent here, as elsewhere, by the National Committee on Child Labor, and his photographs, distributed widely in America, had a lot to do with the eventual passage of federal laws abolishing child labor. We also find in 1847 that young women were being recruited from upcountry farms to work at the Naumkeag Mill. They were raised in Yankee habits of industry and modesty, dexterous sewers and spinners. They were also being recruited by the factory managers of Lowell and other established places. So Salem had to compete with wages, working conditions, and cultural amenities. The Naumkeag proprietors had long brick boarding houses set apart for these young single men and women coming from throughout New England. At the outset, they came in droves. At the same time, for the first time, thousands of Irish were arriving in Boston, fleeing the potato famine. And these rural people were desperate to start over and willing to take any work they could find. Salem seemed congenial with an extant Catholic church. The mill owners suddenly had a new pool of cheap and readily replaceable labor, albeit one with no training in industrial production or in the cultural values of Yankeedom. So we found 2 main classes of mill worker: upcountry Yankees and poor Irish refugees. Almost overnight, by 1850, they had increased the population by about 4,000 people, with many more to come in the next few years. And you can see the explosion in population between, I mean, this is 5 years before 1850. To take a snapshot at the demographics of the neighborhood, I analyzed the 1850 federal census, 1855 Massachusetts state census, and the 1860 US federal census. And I isolated the boarding houses in the Point neighborhood, and I compared the numbers and the demographics I found there to the greater ward that the Point is part of, Ward 3. So in 1850, there's 225 boarding house residents. 30% were Massachusetts natives. Most came from other rural towns throughout the state. 29 were immigrants from Ireland, England, Scotland, and Canada, and 41% were what we call in-migrants, so people from other states. When I compared these to the overall Ward 3 population, nearly 70% of the Ward 3 population was born in Massachusetts. So you compare that with the 30% that's in the boarding houses, is kind of astounding. Only 19% were immigrants, and only 11% overall were in-migrants from different states.
So, one of the things that we also found in looking at the industrial workers who had been recruited under highly competitive circumstances, it's one of the things that you see the officers of the Naumkeag Steam Cotton Company are very concerned about competing with Lowell and Lawrence, new place up there called Methuen. Everyone wants the skilled workers. No one wants to overpay them. And then suddenly with the advent that is totally unlooked for and surprising of the Irish, everything changes. So they had assiduously competed and cultivated these young women to come down and work specifically in Salem because of special things that they would do for the Salem girls. One of the things we found in a very inadvertent way was that in the boarding houses that the Naumkeag Steam Cotton Company built for the young women and for some young men as well, they actually provided their meals for them. They had cooks in the boarding houses. So that was as Amy said, the amenities were an important part of this. You even see in the newspapers of the time, as early as 1845, the newspaper editors are very concerned that when this building is finished, that a stable class of people comes to work in Salem, and that they're attracted for the right reasons, that this isn't a roving industrial population that's going to have a severe impact on the city that's going to change the nature of what Salem seems to them to be. And so it's a real irony that for the first few years of the operation of this mill, the owners are so concerned about outcompeting other owners elsewhere, and then suddenly they don't even have to think about it anymore because they're overwhelmed with an endless labor pool coming from Ireland of people who are desperate to throw their little children into a mill and have them do the work. Another thing that's, I think, really interesting that we found as we looked at the demographics of all of this is when the factory was at its height by 1850, when they'd worked out all the kinks and when it was producing literally, millions of yards of first quality cotton. And I should say they immediately knew that they had a fabulous product, and they entered the Naumkeag Steam Cotton Company cloth into all the big regional and national competitions, and it always won the gold medal. So they had something wonderful going on there. Part of it was, as Charles T. James had assured David Pingree, the location on a harbor meant that there would always be a degree of moisture in the air, humidity in the air, that made for a superior finish to the cotton weave. And indeed, that turned out to be the case. But no matter how successful this place was, and no matter how many, literally thousands of people showed up almost overnight to participate, because you're looking at 600 brand new factory hands, and a large number of those people were married, and so they're bringing spouses and children and in-laws with them. Despite all this humanity associated with this factory, we have not been able to find even one Salem-born person who worked here before 1860. So this is an entirely immigrant and in-migrant population that is literally creating a separate new industrial village of people who have nothing to do, no history with the larger community, and the larger community is not creating a new history with them. So pretty interesting stuff. Here we are on Lafayette Street. This is a street that runs on the high end of the point. It's the main thoroughfare. And of course, what happens by the 1850s is there is a managerial and overseer category of in-migrant who comes here, and these are the people who are paid well by the Naumkeag proprietors, and they begin to build large, fine homes on the upper end of the point in the 1840s and 1850s in the Greek Revival and Italianate styles. And so it's not just the workers, it's not just the immigrants who are coming here to do this. There are people who are leaving factories. Foremen and managers are leaving factories in Providence and other places in New England to come in and work in the behemoth. Yep. So we have, this is essentially a good look at almost a machine shop. We're still inside the Naumkeag Mill, but we have in the foreground, you see a table of odd parts. One of the things that the mill could not have been built without, as I mentioned earlier, these young mechanics who were turning themselves into steam engine builders and machinery builders. But of course, a mill this large, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of equipment to fill up 4 floors. Much of it was brand new, and although some of it seems to come from Providence producers, it definitely was the case that a man named Increase S. Hill of Salem ended up with the largest contract in the mid-1840s to produce all of this equipment brand new for the company. And this guy was innovating in steam engine production. He was coming up with new techniques under the guidance of Charles T. James. And so this mill is not just a place that's producing cloth and employing hands. It's also leading edge, innovative technology that's happening under this enormous roof. So here, this is another look at the point in terms of its residential development. It was fascinating to us to see how quickly the place grew, the 20 acres. The streets got laid out in 2 batches, and almost none of the housing was constructed by the company other than the boarding houses. Everything else was built on spec by Salem people who saw the opportunity to build first-class tenement housing and boarding houses for an influx population. And as you've seen from the 1853 lithograph, it was a beautiful urban neighborhood. There was nothing tenement-like about it. At any rate, the real point to it is that it made its stockholders very, very rich. They kept reinvesting in leading-edge technology. It keeps attracting new people. One of the things that we find happening a lot is that these young women being recruited from upcountry get married within a year or 2 of moving to Salem, so that they're being replaced largely by people who are willing to work for less, and many of them are Irish. For the Irish, arriving in the shores of an unknown country that isn't really very friendly to them, having this kind of opportunity is a godsend. They are, although we think of it as somewhat brutal that they're throwing their children into these mills, so were Yankee people throwing their children into the mills. It was part of the culture. And we have found little kids running around doing specific jobs as sweepers and other essential parts of this early form of industry. The one thing that the new population, as I say, they're not people from Salem, and no people from Salem join them. The one thing they come up with institutionally in their new home is a Methodist church. And so you're looking at the Lafayette Street Methodist Church. It's built in the Point in 1853. There was no real Methodist church in Salem. In fact, the Methodist sect had not prospered in Salem. Traditionally, it was a working class Protestant sect, and it was very much women-oriented. So it's not a coincidence that here in the Point, the city's only Methodist church is built in 1853, and the chief financier for the Methodists is David Pingree. So we start with an almost empty piece of land that leads down to a marine railway and a couple of very small oil refineries. And we see the Point growing as uniquely as the site of Salem's leading industry. It was the only place in the city that was devoted to manufacturing and to industrial workers. So we see it not just as an enclave of industry and the economy, but it is literally the only place in the city, and I think maybe one of the few places in all of New England where the original mix is about half immigrant and half Yankee in-migrant. These people need to find a way to get along with each other. We find the Yankees do not leave the Point. Largely, they stay there, other than the girls who are getting married. The families who have come to work there from other places in New England, the Protestant Yankee families, once the Irish arrive, they all live together. They stay, and the Point grows. More streets are laid out. It's not as if the Yankees are displaced by the Irish. So it's going to be very interesting for us to see how these two groups get along over time and the level of friendship and intermarriage. And we're just starting to look at that.
Absolutely. So as Bob was saying, we have really only begun to scratch the surface of the studying to be done here. There are so many more stories to be told, and these are the images of the people that work there. These are the ones that were telling their story. These are the people that deserve to have their story told, and they really gave meaning to this entire industrial revolution of Salem, and really not a revolution, but a rebirth of Salem's economy, and these were the men, women, and lots of children who had made this happen. So we definitely have, we are at the point in our research where we definitely have more questions than we have answers at this point, as I'm sure all of you can definitely say is often the case. But these men, women, and children really did an incredible feat of engineering, and it's a testament to our city's will to thrive and survive in a new era. And Stanislaus Beauvais helped out. So, there you go. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you. Julie.
Just curious what your sources are for the photographs.
The photographs are a combination of a collection that I found through the National Archives from 1907. The name of the photographer is escaping me right now. And then the photographs of the children, such as Stanislaus Beauvais here, these are Louis Hine photographs from 1911, 1912.
Where's that collection?
That collection is also on
Two places.
Yes.
Louis Hine was arguably the great industrial photographer of America in the early part of the 20th century. And his work was such that it came into the ownership of the United States government as fundamental to our history. So today, his collections are kept by the Library of Congress as well as by the National Archives.
Both of us. Yep.
When did the mill decline and why?
The mill never declined. The mill became the most profitable and successful cotton textile producer in New England. In 1859, they added a building even larger than the first building. In 1868, they added another building. And by the 1870s, they had 5 mills. And it never declined. I mean, there were moments where it slumped. Obviously, cotton was hard to come by in the Civil War. And, you know, we're not even addressing the issues of New England and cotton producing South and the implications for slavery, the amazing turn of events that makes Africa the primary consumer of cotton cloth that is produced in Salem, Massachusetts. There's all this amazing, wonderful economic and tragic history involved in all of this. But one thing that never stopped happening is a very high level of profits for the investors in the mills. The only thing that stopped these mills was the fire of 1914 that totally
did
wiped
rebuild
out
after that,
everything
too.
you've seen and all of the factory buildings. And as Amy says, they rebuilt.
They rebuilt and they became Pequot mills after and it also was electrified after the Great Fire. Prior to that, had been run only on steam. So, anybody else?
So, is this Pequot Mill still running?
No.
Nope.
No, now that is Shetland Park, which is really, it's got the best view for a storage facility. Yeah,
It's an office
Water.
park that has a lot of storage and warehousing.
Like registry deeds.
It's an eyesore.
And
Cotton mill, when did the Pequot shut down?
Pequot,
Cotton manufacturing.
it shut down after World War II.
it actually, during the two wars, it went over into manufacturing woolen blankets for the military.
You know, those nice green, scratchy,
Yep.
that's
Made
Pequot.
a lot of money that way, but like all the other textile producers in New England, they were looking at going south. There had been, there'd been peaceful unionizing going on at Naumkeag and at Shetland, or Pequot, I should say, but everyone else had already moved south, and they couldn't resist going south.
I'm sorry, one follow-up. How did Salem compare to Lowell? Lowell was also a huge cotton manufacturing city.
Lowell was way bigger. Lowell was way bigger, but of course,
Many more mills.
Individual company was bigger than that?
This was the
this
the
individual
largest
building
single-
was the largest
mill.
single building.
Yeah,
Lowell-
Lowell had many more.
Yeah.
It's important to understand that Lowell's technology was driven by falling water.
Instead of steam.
What happened at Salem was a completely different technology that essentially showed the rest of the seaports, many of which were dying on the East Coast, that anyone could build a factory and put people to work. All you needed was steam power. You didn't need a waterfall.
Alyssa was
I
going
was going to comment on actually the slavery tie-in.
Yeah.
So at the moment that it's being built, I mean, there's very notable and historic abolitionist activity taking place in Salem.
Yeah, there was.
Anybody commenting at the same time on how Salem is making its money off of the products of slavery?
As far as we've been able to find so far, no. No one is saying this and that are a problem. They are at odds with one another. It isn't until a bit later that seems to start showing up and they start saying, well,
Although we may find it.
We may find that, but
Right,
we
right,
haven't.
That would be
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yep.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it definitely is a major connection.
But Amy, I don't think anybody ever complained in Salem about them making all their money off the opium trade either.
They did not.
More out of the depths of, April in 1690.
Today.
Right.
Yes.
But during the Civil War, I mean, did they make more money because of the war effort? Did they?
We haven't
To be
found
honest,
yet.
we're not looking at the Civil War. We're looking at the origins here. We've confined ourselves so far to the 1840s and 50s.
What I have started to find, though, is that when the Civil War did come along and all of the men shipped out, that was really when women became the breadwinners of the family for the first time, which is really fascinating, too. Yes, sorry.
So all these children were working there. Were the parents also working in the factories?
Most of the time, yes. Yes, they were either in the factory or in other industries throughout the town.
It's a real irony that in 1855, Salem becomes one of the earlier sites for a state normal school. So education is a really big deal to the middle class in Salem, and it always was. And so here's a college for young women to be trained to become teachers in public school at the same time that a very significant part of the population can't even put its children in a public school.
Is there any effort being made in Salem to try and broadcast this history.
You can make the checks out to, no, I'm kidding. I wish. That's actually
We've
exactly
been
what
offered millions of dollars for this information, and we thought it would give it to you today almost free.
It has not really been brought to the forefront of public history in Salem.
We have a room full of pink balloons, however.
We did have a room of pink balloons. That's
They've
definitely
done a good
important.
job in Lowell with
I
the
mean,
National Historic Site, they really have.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely. Yeah, this definitely, it has not become, this whole chunk of Salem's history, as far as we've been able to see, has not really been incorporated into the narrative of Salem's overall history. I've been talking to people and I'm saying, yeah, I'm studying the industrial history of Salem, and they say, what industrial history of Salem? And it hurts a little bit because, but that's our goal, is actually to make this become part of the
We're going to
conversation.
manufacture a new line of history here.
I think that's a great
Process.
idea. I really-
Yeah.
And have you guys both been working, I assume too, especially with the Point neighborhood, Liz Duclos Marcello,
Yep.
and I'm blanking on the name of the professor, I'm so sorry right now. Yes, Liz Blood.
Oh,
Who've been studying the immigrant history of the Point,
I
which
haven't
ties
yet.
obviously into the industrial history of the Point.
I haven't
So-
yet. That's a
so
really
they've
good
been
idea.
Doing, not this work
Right.
for a long time, but they've been definitely looking at the history of the neighborhoods and who's lived there for a long time, so. And they've done a lot of walking tours in Salem and a lot of presentations in Salem on kind of that specific part of the Point neighborhood, so.
Well,
Those of us in the area definitely have an interest in more than the 1692 story.
It hasn't really approached, though, people,
Yeah.
you know, coming as tourists to Boston, going up to Salem, they never hear this.
It hurts that we don't have a central institution for the interpretation of history.
Right. I think
So
that
that,
hurts.
it's always a challenge to get
Well,
anything out there.
there is one in Rowley.
Yes.
And that was spoken by one of the officers.
I mean, that's not,
Which would also take this
that's not
$1
that far from Salem.
Just a hop, skip, and a jump up Route 1.
Do the best we can.
We do. We spend a lot of time in Raleigh for this.
Okay,
Any other
I
questions?
think we need to
or-
move on.
There we go. Thank you very
Thank you
much
very
for
much
your
for your
time.
We need a partner.
Stanley Beauvais.